Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1110. This is your final of 3 lectures for week 7 of the semester. I so appreciate your patience and flexibility and all of the time, effort, labor, and care that goes into doing the work for this class. I know that it's summer. I know that this week in particular is a lot, and I'm so grateful to you for being understanding also about just the time it takes for me to grade your work, because it's important to me to give you feedback that is meaningful and not super rushed. So let's go ahead and dive into this writing the concentrated close read lecture. This, of course, is the second half of your in-depth lecture for this week. This is the writing strategy focused portion, which means that here I will be concentrating on the prompt for the concentrated close read, as well as talking through strategies for how to begin thinking about writing process, as this is where we're going to be pivoting to for the duration of the semester, okay? Oops. All right, there we go. So on the agenda for today, we have the assignment prompt, the writing process, and formatting guidelines. Now, what this means is that we're not only going to be talking through the concentrated close read, we'll also be talking through how to go about thinking about your writing, specifically for something that is kind of a mini essay, if you will, and then also the formatting that you'll need to make sure you closely abide by, both for this assignment and for future writing assignments. So let's start with the assignment prompt. Now, the concentrated close read, as I mentioned in the overview lecture, is core assignment 1 of 3, and it's due on Sunday, June 27th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern to Carmen. That is, of course, the recommended weekly deadline. If you would like to use until the last day of June to submit this assignment, that's perfectly fine. It is not considered late. It's just considered that you turned it in by the monthly deadline. Now, before starting this assignment, you'll need to watch the music videos assigned for week 7, which is Miley Cyrus week, and Black Mirror season 5, episode 3, titled Rachel, Jack, and Ashley 2 on Netflix. Be sure to also carefully review the overview and both in-depth lectures from week 7. Each of these materials is designed to prepare you for this core assignment, okay? So I know it's a really tremendous bundle of things, but that's also partially why I try to give you until the last day of the month, in the hopes that if you need more time than a specific week to get to everything, that it hopefully builds in that time for you. Now, the prompt reads, from the content you watched from Miley Cyrus week, select one of these 19 texts to act as your primary source. That is one music video from this week or the Black Mirror episode. In this assignment, your task is to analyze how this primary source represents, complicates, or comments on aspects of Americanness. The primary source should be the focus of the paper, though in the introductory paragraph, you should also include relevant context that helps to establish the credibility of your argument and observations. Okay, and we'll dive into a little bit more of that here. Now, in your assignment, you must do the following. Make an argument about how your selected text is engaged with Americanness. This argument should be a total of 3 paragraphs, with 1 paragraph acting as the introduction and 2 paragraphs acting as body paragraphs. So there's no conclusion for this assignment. The introduction should draw in some way upon what we have learned about Miley Cyrus's career, Disney, Hollywood, and stardom, to ensure that the reader is familiar with the larger context of this primary source and recognizes its contributions to U.S. popular culture at large. The introduction should also establish what the central message/argument of the text is and how this message connects to Americanness. The body paragraph should then build on this introduction by close reading critical details from the primary source and applying concepts from the course to demonstrate how this text connects to Americanness. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. So you've got 3 paragraphs to write, okay? Now the first paragraph is your introduction, and the paragraphs 2 and 3 are your body paragraphs, okay? Now in this introduction paragraph, what you're gonna need to do is provide some context or kind of background information as to how we arrive at this point of you writing about this specific Miley Cyrus text, okay? So a lot of what we cover then in the previous in-depth lecture installment is gonna be really critical, as you're gonna wanna draw upon some of those details and things to be able to have this kind of context section in your own paper, all right? Now, part of the reason why this is important is because without context, a reader who's unfamiliar with Miley Cyrus perhaps is not going to be able to pick up on certain details that you're highlighting, but more specifically, it's going to be important that you establish the significance of why it matters that you're writing about this text at all, okay? And so because you're going to be providing this, kind of contextual information to the reader, you're also going to want to make sure in the introduction to establish, what is the argument or central message or content communicated by the text that you've selected, right? So just like we've been doing In your process posts and discussion board posts, you're going to want to make sure that you establish that you comprehend what the creator is arguing or talking about in their text, and how exactly the visuals and just kind of details that they're utilizing is making it possible for them to convey their argument. And so for here, you're going to want to be able to make some sort of connection between the text that you select and Americanness. So it's going to require that you really define what exactly Americanness consists of. And the concepts that we've studied so far in class are kind of stepping stones towards making sense of what Americanness is comprised of, okay? Now, you'll also need to close read 1 to 2 critical details in the text that demonstrate this connection. So these critical details are strategies or techniques that the creator uses in the content and or form of the text to bring their vision to life. These details may consist of, but are not limited to, significant moments / scenes in the text, aspects of the text related to the setting or people, lyrics in the song and their connection to the visual that appears on screen in the music video, etc. Plan to close read 1 critical detail per body paragraph. In the course of your analysis, you should also evaluate how effective this critical detail is in conveying the central message of or argument of the creator's text. So just like in the discussion board posts, when I say to you, select 1 critical detail to write about and articulate for me why it's significant in making a contribution to the larger text. What's its function? What does it do? Does it work really well? That is exactly what you're doing here in your body paragraphs. The only difference is that you're selecting the Miley Cyrus text from this week that you want to work with, and then you're going to focus in on 1 critical detail per paragraph, okay? So an example of this might be if you wanted to write about, let's say, mother's daughter, maybe your critical detail in paragraph 1 is the color scheme, okay? And then maybe your critical detail in paragraph 2 is Miley Cyrus's costuming, okay? Another example could be if you wrote about Can't Be Tamed, maybe your critical detail in paragraph 1 is the bird cage, and your critical detail in paragraph 2 is the wings that she's wearing, right? So you see how what you're doing is you're really highlighting and identifying and emphasizing specific details in the text that you feel are really important to talk about and to make sure that the reader really understands kind of what's going on in this text, okay? And then in the course of that, you should also include some attention to, how effective is this particular detail in communicating the message or argument of the text. So if Miley Cyrus is making an argument related to being unable to be tamed and can't be tamed, does the bird cage and do the bird wings, do those do enough to communicate that point? How effective are they in communicating that argument? And then apply 2 concepts we have covered this semester to your close reading of the text, with 1 concept applied per body paragraph. 1 concept should be from an in-depth lecture from weeks 1 to 6, and the other concept should be from the in-depth lecture from week 7, of course, the one before this. Each body paragraph should feature a close reading of 1 critical detail from the primary source in which a concept from class is applied. This concept application is intended to help you demonstrate how Americanness is represented in the text. Okay, so you've got your 1 critical detail per paragraph, right? And you're also going to need to incorporate concepts that we've talked about in class into your analysis, just like you've been doing in the process posts. So you see how the discussion board posts then have been preparing you for this process of selecting a critical detail, and the process posts have been preparing you for the process of applying a concept. You're really bringing those 2 skills together. So what's going to be important here, and this is where students who don't pay attention to details sometimes get a little stumbled, you want to make sure that in one of your paragraphs, you apply a concept that we talked about between weeks 1 to 6. So it should come from one of those, kind of Google slide presentations or lectures, okay? And then 1 concept should come from the lecture from this week. So you want to make sure that you satisfy this requirement. Otherwise, you have not satisfied the requirements of the prompt. It does not mean that paragraph 1 has to be a concept from weeks 1 to 6 and paragraph 2 has to be a concept from week 7. It could be reversed, that maybe you use a week 7 concept in paragraph 1 and a week 1 through 6 concept in paragraph 2. Totally fine, but you need to make sure that you use 1 concept from each of these time frames, okay? And the reason I ask this is because in week 7, we're obviously concentrating, I should say, specifically on Miley Cyrus. But in weeks 1 to 6, we're talking about a lot of other topics. And so I want to see you do the process of kind of building connections across weeks, just like you had to do in process post number 4, okay? Okay, so the required formatting for this assignment is 3 paragraphs total, with 1 paragraph acting as the intro and 2 paragraphs acting as body paragraphs. Each paragraph should be a minimum of 4 to 5 sentences, but no more than 10 sentences. It should be double spaced, 1-inch margins, 12-point font, Times New Roman, and Word document or PDF file. Okay, these are the requirements that need to be met in terms of formatting to ensure that you do not lose points on this assignment. So let's talk writing process. All right. So we're going to be kind of thinking about argumentation from this week onwards in terms of your own writing alongside assessing other people's argument. So crafting an argument is a lot like baking a pie. If you don't have a strong foundation, which is, your pie crust, which we can kind of see here, the rest of your pie is at risk of falling apart. Your pie will develop in appearance and consistency as you write the core assignments. For now, your priority is to work on the pie filling and the individual pie slices that comprise the full pie. So again, the concentrated close read is our first step into doing a traditional essay form, which is what the primary source analysis consists of. So we want to really think about the fact that we're doing a pie baking process. And so, kind of as you work through the core assignments, you're going to find that the pie or argument pie, if you will, that you start to bake will really start to take form and will really start to build. But temporarily, we're focusing on that filling, which is this part, and then the individual pie slices. So, each slice that you cut from the pie as you consume it. Now, when I think about argumentation, it's helped me to kind of break it down into these visual pieces. So the pie crust is like your thesis, okay? The full pie is going to be the entire argument. Each pie slice is going to be each paragraph and the claim that you make in each paragraph in the topic sentence. The pie filling, which is the central part here, is the evidence close reading, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The pie decoration, which is this, is the evidence secondary connection. And the pie tin or pie plate, whatever you put the pie on, is the conclusion, okay? Now, these are the 4 elements of the pie that you're focused on drafting for the concentrated close read, which is the pie crust, the full pie, the pie slice, and the pie filling. We're not really going to talk about pie decoration and pie tin necessarily. That's going to come along a little bit later alongside kind of the PSA and then the final project. So let's think about kind of how we can understand the composition of a pie, but also the composition of an argument. Now you'll notice that I'll talk about things in sections as opposed to a 5-paragraph essay format. Now you might have been taught to write a 5-paragraph essay in high school, and that's totally okay. But I want you to kind of start unpacking that a little bit more, because we want to think about things as kind of being in sections in your argument, because it gives you a little bit more creative wiggle room if at times you need to add more or less to a section depending on what you're saying. So let's start with the introductory section. And, when I think about the introductory section, or the introduction, as it's often called, it's composed of kind of 3 parts: the primary source introduction, the larger context, and the elaboration of argument. So again, we kind of got this image in our minds of a pie, right? And a pie crust is going to be a really integral part of making sure that the pie that we are baking is in a good enough form that it's going to be able to kind of, support the rest of this delicious dessert that you're in the process of creating, right? So your pie crust is your thesis. And to bake a good thesis, you're going to need ingredients, which are the introduction, a dough, which is the context. You need to roll out that dough into the elaboration of argument, and then the formed crust will be the thesis. So to even get to this point, right? And again, I know sometimes when you bake pie, you can buy a crust at the store. We'll get to that. But just kind of imagine here with me that the ingredients that go into this are the introduction, the dough that's going to eventually become this is the context. And when you roll out the dough, you're elaborating on what your argument is to give us this nice formed crust. So if we think about this baking process and steps, the introduction is all about outlining your ingredients. You're telling us what you've got. You're telling us what you're using. You're telling us how much you're using, why you're using it, where does it go in the process, right? It's really establishing for us, this is what I'm using. This is what belongs in my recipe, okay? Now the introduction in your essay is much the same thing, that you're outlining for us this is the text that I'm looking at. Here's how I'm working with it. Here are the ingredients, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, here's what I need to make my argument. Now, the context is going to be the batter that you whisk together. As you combine these various ingredients together, you start to create the context. Now, of course, some of these ingredients won't be used in the batter. It'll be used somewhere else. And not all of these ingredients are being used all the exact same way, right? But part of what you need in an introduction to make a strong argument is a batter. And the batter is going to be what eventually is rolled out into the elaboration of argument and then becomes the thesis crust, okay? But we can't have a thesis if we don't know where we've started from and we haven't rolled out and identified what are the kind of, various ingredients and things that we need in order to even get to this point. Context is the same thing. We need to know the context of maybe what happened historically, what happened in society, what happened with a particular artist, what happened in a particular region, et cetera, right? These are the things we need to know to be able to kind of see that crust and be able to recognize that it's strong, okay? Now, with your dough and your context, as you work through your context, which means kind of, elaborating on what your context is and interweaving it a bit with the rest of kind of, how you're planning to approach this essay, what you're doing is you're molding the argument pie. You're molding how it's going to be shaped. You're identifying what are the boundaries or limitations of it, right? You can only fit so much into this pie crust. And so you're really establishing for us, this is what I am setting out to do. Which brings us to the thesis statement or the pie crust. Now, the thesis statement or the crust is the result of combining the ingredients into a dough and rolling out the dough to prepare it for the pie tin or bowl. The sturdiness, strength, durability of your thesis statement depends on how well you have combined the ingredients into dough and rolled it out into a crust. If you have done an effective job of creating intro and context sections, the thesis will be well supported and your reader is more likely to interpret your argument or thesis as well researched and convincing. The purpose of the thesis statement is to communicate in a succinct manner what you are arguing about the primary source. This argument should clearly state what concept or issue related to Americanness your primary source is engaged with and what the significance of this is, okay? So, as you can already see, even though we're not at this point quite yet, the thesis statement and the pie tin or bowl, which is the conclusion, need to match in size. You don't want one to be more elaborate or bigger than the other because then they're not well balanced. It's not going to work if your crust is way too big for the plate that you've selected for it. Now, again, the sturdiness of your thesis is going to be a matter of how much are you devoting time and energy to the ingredients, to the dough, to rolling out the dough, right? Without doing those steps, you might be able to write a thesis or create a crust, but you don't exactly have the sturdiness that's going to hold up in the process of baking the rest of this argument pie, okay? So that's why the introduction is important, is because it not only establishes the foundation for your argument, but it also helps to identify the contours of this argument and helps the reader know that you know why you're doing what you're doing. Now, if you think back to when I said earlier that some people buy their pie crust instead of making it, here's kind of a way in which you can perhaps buy your pie crust instead of having to make it entirely on your own. So what I've provided for you here are 3 examples of thesis statements Mad Libs, right? And so Mad Libs is like those games that you can play like in the car or wherever, where it's like, somebody says, give me a noun, give me a verb, give me an adjective. And you can't totally see what they're plugging those words into until you read the story back. And then it, sounds all kinds of weird. Well, here we've kind of taken that format, but we've kind of reimagined it so that it can serve our purposes in baking this argument pie. So I've created 3 different examples of how you can kind of have a template for your thesis statement if you're finding that writing one without some guidelines is proving to be a little too challenging. So one example would be that in here you would put name of author's title of primary source, effectively, successfully, convincingly, unsuccessfully, unconvincingly, meaningfully, ineffectively. You'll pick one of these, right? Uses critical detail, name 1 to 3, to argue / demonstrate / show / distort, represent, et cetera, et cetera. You'll pick one of these, how, that, and then argument. So in this first example, what you would do is you would provide us with Miley Cyrus is, and then name of the music video, or, talk about the episode. And you would include an evaluative term. Now, an evaluative term is going to be something like effectively, meaningfully, unconvincingly, that establishes for us from the jump how successful or how well you find that a particular detail is working to communicate the argument that the creator is making, okay? So whatever creative or kind of critical detail, I should say, that you focus on here, maybe it's color scheme, a certain use of props. If you think back to, the first week of the semester, maybe it's like, I don't know, body language, facial expressions, right? Whatever critical detail you choose to focus on, you want to make sure that you establish for us, are you going to write about it as being something that's working really well to communicate the argument? Or is it something you're focusing on because maybe it kind of prevents the argument from being successful, okay? And then here you would use one of these terms like argue, interrogate, etc. And then you would proceed to tell us what the argument is related to Americanness in the text that you've selected, okay? That's one example. The second example I have for you is the critical detail / concept / issue presented, featured, found in name of author's title of primary source, functions as a or an symbol, metaphor, allegory, etc. of concept, issue / theme to blah, 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 how, argument. So in this case, you would lead with the critical detail that you're focusing on. This especially works well if maybe there's an umbrella term you could use that is applicable to both of the critical details you plan to discuss in your body paragraphs. And then you would kind of include, the primary source information after the fact. And then you'd want to characterize what exactly this thing is or is functioning as. Is it representing something larger? Is it symbolizing something in society? Is it maybe changing or distorting something that's familiar to us, right? What is it functioning to do? You'll also have concept, issue, or theme here. And then you eventually build to the argument. And then finally, example 3, we have based on / taking into account information that you would have just discussed in the elaboration of argument. I argue that blank. Now, example 3 is definitely a lot more to the point. It also definitely relies on you've been gradually kind of giving us nuggets of your argument up until this point. But any of these 3 you could use as kind of starting templates for creating your pie crust. You also are not required to use these, but it is helpful to kind of look at some of the terminology you see here and see where you might be able to incorporate some of that into your own thesis. All right, so here's where we're going to talk about close reading as a section. Now, the close reading section is generally talked about as the body paragraphs in the 5-paragraph essay, but the close reading section can be understood as the part of your paper where you are focused on performing the analysis, okay? Now, this is comprised of evidence close readings and application of concepts, which again, you've been doing evidence close readings in the discussion board posts, and you've been doing application of concepts in the process posts. So you've already been doing this work. You're now just kind of bringing it together, okay? Now, when we think about how exactly we can understand what the function of the thesis is in the paper, if we think about a pie slice, every time you slice a piece of pie, yeah, okay. For a second there, I was like, did I say that wrong? No. Every time you slice a pie and you cut a piece, there we go. Every time you cut a piece of pie, okay, you're going to have a part of the crust attached to it, right? Not only in terms of this base right here and the side, but also up top. This should really represent for us in terms of thinking about your paper, how your thesis is connected to what you're doing in every paragraph. So if the whole pie is the whole argument and the crust is the thesis, if you notice, this thesis is attached to this pie filling that we've got right here, right? Now that pie filling is going to be your evidence close reading. And so when you create a pie slice, which is your paragraph and claim, you'll want to think about how much are you cutting from your larger argument to address in this paragraph, because every slice of your pie has to contribute a smaller piece of the full argument, okay? Now, so if we think about this full slice as paragraph and claim, the pie filling is the critical detail you chose to close read in the primary source, okay? So thinking back to the example of like color scheme, let's say, this pie filling is comprised of all of the close reading and analysis you're doing related to color scheme in your particular text. Now, the full pie slice is each body paragraph in your concentrated close read, okay? So every time there's a paragraph, I want you to like envision or visualize in your mind a slice of pie. The critical detail you focus on in the text, plus the number of sentences in the paragraph used to analyze this detail, equals the size of the slice. So some slices are bigger than others. If you have a paragraph, let's say that's 10 to 11 sentences, some slices of pie are smaller than others. Let's say, 4 to 5 sentences, right? But the point is that every paragraph is represented by a slice. And so what you're doing in the paragraph is the content of this pie, the filling, this part, right? And the size of the paragraph is the size of your slice. How big is it? Now, the number and size of the slices in the pie is determined by the scope of your project and the kinds of ingredients or details that you use. Some pies are more elaborate than others because you got all the time to do the baking. Some pies are just to the point, simple, quick. You didn't have a lot of time before people showed up and were hungry, right? But the point is that your slice should be suitable to the conditions in which you are writing, which means that if you know you've got a certain number of sentences that you've got to write to fulfill the criteria for that, paragraph, which you do, you need to make sure that your pie slice abides by that criteria, okay? Now, ingredients can be thought of as the critical details from the primary source. We talked about this a little bit a moment ago in terms of the introduction, right? How you mix them together into a pie filling is how you apply concepts from the course. So when you're identifying in the intro paragraph the ingredients that go into your argument, we should still see evidence of those ingredients at, kind of at work in the body paragraph. So you don't want to necessarily surprise us with something that we don't know is going to be in there. Occasionally that can work well, but, for the most part, if you're thinking about like people having dietary restrictions or allergies or taste preferences, right? You're typically going to be more, to the point, specific, et cetera, when it comes to what you're putting into your slice. So with your ingredients then, we want to make sure that each of those slices are really working well and that you've mixed them together, just like, kind of the dough that you've got for context. We want to make sure that you're using ingredients that make sense for each of your paragraphs. So in the case of the concentrated close read, you've got a full pie that you're baking, but you're only really baking 2 slices, right? Or cutting 2 slices, I should say. Because when you think about each slice being a part of the larger argument, right? If we recall that the crust is the thesis and the crust is comprised of the ingredients and the dough, the introduction is already represented here by way of this beautiful crust, right? But the body paragraphs or the close reading section is going to be represented by 2 slices of pie. So in that respect, for the concentrated close read, you're basically cutting your pie right down the middle, okay? Especially because there's no conclusion. I know that this pie has a plate, so it's technically got a conclusion, but we're going to pretend it's not there. You are responsible for the crust and for the pie filling that you will cut into 2 pieces. All right, evidence close reading, your pie filling. So again, if your full pie is your argument and each of your pie slices is a paragraph, right? And you've only got 2, 1, 2, don't worry about all these other ones. And your pie filling is your close reading, okay? So what you're filling up that crust with. What the heck goes into a pie filling? Well, an evidence close reading is the pie filling, which comprises the majority of the pie, hint, hint, majority of the pie, and produces the flavor associated with that pie. It is the combination of some of your ingredients. The rest of those ingredients go to the thesis. It builds upon the foundation of the pie crust to develop and bake properly. See, so it needs this thesis in order to become a pie. Otherwise, it's just a damn mess. The size of the pie is determined by how much is needed to satisfy the appetite of the consumer or consumers. The number of pie slices or paragraphs could be mistaken as being arbitrary, when in actuality, it is determined by how many consumers there are and what slice size, I get that every time, and what slice size they each want at the time. The pie filling must be mixed together well before being added to the crust. Otherwise, the consumer will take a bite and will immediately identify that it is incomplete or improperly combined. The pie filling needs enough ingredients to be combined well before pouring and enough time to bake. Failing to complete any or all of these steps will result in an ugly and or bad tasting pie. Our goal for this latter half of the semester is that you are not baking ugly or undercooked pie. We don't want it. We don't like it. We're not here for it, right? We are committed to the beautiful aesthetic, fully baked, beautiful pie, okay? So when you're approaching, oh my gosh, I'm like losing my ability to talk. When you're approaching a close reading, an evidence close reading paragraph focuses on analyzing a specific detail from the primary source. Okay, so you're concentrating on a set number of ingredients. You're not getting too elaborate with it. It's not losing kind of its focus and getting into too many tangents, okay? So when you're constructing a close reading, it can be approached and understood through the acronym TREAT. T stands for topic sentence, right there, that makes a claim about the critical detail, the argument slice. So the topic sentence of each of your body paragraphs should give us a topic sentence, or should give us a claim. I don't know how I just said topic sentence twice. Topic sentence should give us a claim about the critical detail you're about to analyze, okay? And that topic sentence should have a claim that slices from the thesis, because the thesis is the whole crust, right? So the claim that you make in each of these slices should be associated with and a smaller part of the thesis at large that you're constructing here. R stands for review. Review what the critical detail is comprised of, or summarize. So in each paragraph, after you give us that topic sentence, you're going to want to then proceed to summarize or synthesize for us where and when this critical detail shows up in the primary source. Now, you don't want to necessarily expend more labor on this than maybe 2 to 3 sentences. 4 sentences is pushing it. 2 to 3 sentences is typically ideal, just to refresh and remind the reader where this detail shows up. It also is really helpful for readers who have not seen the text that you're engaging with to have a recap for where you're looking in this material, okay? E is for examine. Examine the strategy by applying a concept from class, concept application. So after you've reviewed for us where in the text and when in the text this detail shows up, you should proceed to examine the strategy that's used by the creator and use a concept to do this. So for example, if you're talking about color scheme as your critical detail in Mother's Daughter, you're going to want to apply some kind of concept like, I don't know, distortion, let's say, as a way of identifying for us the kind of strategy that Miley Cyrus and her creative team are using to communicate the argument of the text, okay? So you're going to want to make a claim about the significance about this or of this critical detail, review for us where this critical detail shows up in the text, and examine how this kind of critical detail is a strategy by applying a concept from class. Now, A is for analyze. Analyze its effectiveness in conveying the text message. This is where you're going to evaluate. And so this is where some of that language related to successfully, unconvincingly, effectively, ineffectively, that's going to be really useful here. You want to establish why you've directed the reader's attention to this particular detail, and did you do so you could discuss something that perhaps prevents the argument from being super clear, or did you do it so that the reader can kind of see how something is working really well in conveying this argument? And finally, T is for transition. Transition to next topic or connect the points. So you want to make sure that every paragraph builds on the other. You don't necessarily want to have a pie where one slice is really awesome and then the next slice is really terrible. So you want to make sure that the last sentence in each body paragraph creates a bridge or a pathway into the next paragraph or the next topic. Now, of course, this is a 2-body paragraph assignment, which means that the transition sentence in your second paragraph is going to need to just kind of wrap up the paper and make sure that it kind of ends in a cohesive way. Okay, so let's talk formatting guidelines. Now, formatting checklist is going to be helpful if you're someone who, before you submit it, you submit the assignment, you start to panic and you're like, oh no, I don't remember what needs to be included, yada, yada. So I've included for you a formatting checklist that you remember from the prompt what your paper needs to look like by the time that you turn it in, okay? Now, the ingredients of MLA format for the concentrated close read that you need to follow are as follows. Document formatting, which is comprised of header, margins, page number, spacing, title, font type, and size. And we're going to kind of walk through what each of these pieces consists of. Okay, so you need to have all of these details from here on out in the concentrated close read, but also just in your English 1110 assignments to make sure that you are doing MLA format. So let's talk about document formatting. The document's formatting refers to the header, margins, page numbers, spacing, title, font type, and font size, which should be consistent throughout the document, except for the header, which only appears on the first page. Okay, so here's where the header for your paper should be placed. Your first name and last name should be at the top. My name should come after this. Please check the spelling. Then the name of the class, the date that you submit the assignment, and then your title of your paper is here and your page number is up here, okay? But this is the header that you need to make sure is included like exclusively on the first page of your assignment. Now the header, again, is information on who is writing the paper, what course they are writing it for, when they are writing / submitting it, and who the professor is. So as I just recapped, the order the header should be written in is first and last name, professor's first and last name, name of the course, and the date. Do not type this into the header section of the document. Write it on the first page in the upper left-hand corner. So you don't want to click on this and then enter it. It will then show up on every page and it's a mess. Now, if you notice from document formatting, this is one part of your document formatting. So this is the first thing that I'm going to look at to make sure that you have it properly written. The next thing I'm going to look at is the margins. And these are the borders of the page that contain where the central information is located. The margin should be 1 inch all the way around. To adjust the margins in Google Docs, go to File and then Page Setup. To adjust the margins in Word, go to Format and Document. I can visually tell if your margins are bigger or smaller than 1 inch. I've graded a lot of papers in my lifetime. I can visually tell when the formatting is all bananas. So please make sure that your margins are correct. Sometimes Word will kind of mess with the margins, or you might have changed the margins for something. Please make sure that you've got 1 inch margins all the way around. You will be docked points if you don't have 1 inch margins. The other thing you need to have is the page number. And this number indicates what page information is occurring in. This is helpful when a paper is being reviewed by a peer or professor in that they can easily refer back to a note they made. This is also especially helpful in the revision process because if you're like me and working on a large project right now that's a couple hundred pages, remembering what's on what page is so helpful. So the page number should be placed in the upper right-hand corner of the document. It should include your last name. Your first name should not be attached, just last name. On Word, this can be done by selecting Insert and then Page Numbers. On Google Docs, select Insert and then Page Numbers, and then you'll be able to add this information. Spacing is one detail of MLA format and formatting guidelines that students sometimes have some issues with. So please make sure you pay attention to this. In MLA format, all paragraphs should be double spaced, not single or 1.5 spaced. There also should not be any excess space between paragraphs. When I look at an essay and I see extra spacing between paragraphs, it throws off the document formatting, but it also throws off your page count, okay? So you need to make sure that you check your spacing settings to ensure that there's no preset on Word or Docs that adds excess space before or after paragraphs. I have found in the last couple of years that Word has been automatically inserting this excess space between paragraphs. And so students will sometimes get marked down points and then panic and be like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? So please make sure that you check your settings and ensure that you don't have that excess spacing because it just throws off the document. You also have the title, and this is something that I will make comments about on the document if you don't have one included. Now, the title of your essay should indicate what you are writing about. This title should be specific and focus on a theme or issue on the paper that is being analyzed. It should not be general or the name of the assignment. So when you turn in the concentrated close read, it should not say the concentrated close read at the top. It should have a title that you have created for it. Now, be sure to keep double-spaced format with the title. There should not be any excess space that fills the page awkwardly. So in this first example, the title reads, Effect of U.S. Flag Raising Photograph. Now, this is a general title. It does have the correct spacing. It is missing a page number though, so there are some formatting issues. It's not bad as the title necessarily. It clarifies that this student is looking particularly at the kind of impact and results of this photograph. However, somebody who glances at the title and doesn't read the paper wouldn't necessarily know which flag raise and photograph they're talking about unless they already kind of, are familiar with that photograph in their life. Okay, so you might want to add a few little details or just kind of build this out slightly. Sometimes if you're working with a historical artifact, it can be helpful to just kind of include like, a year, a photographer, artist name, some sort of detail that helps kind of advance that, like we see here, where, the student chose to include the photographer's name in the first sentence, which works great, but having it in the title would also be important. In the second example, we have Batman and Superman back on 2D. So again, we have a general title. We do have correct spacing and correct page number here, but here again is one of those things where in the first sentence, the student does a great job of clarifying which Batman and Superman text that they're looking at, which is Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. But it would help to have that title in the title, because then that can help to make sure that somebody who is looking at this paper knows what text specifically you are planning to write on, okay? And in each of these, you want to have something that kind of previews or gives a snapshot or commercial to what the essay is about. Sometimes when you just have the title of the text, it functions more as a label rather than a title, okay? Font type and size. This is pretty standard. The only accepted font that meets MLA format in this class is Times New Roman. This font should be used for the essay, the header, the title, the page number, and the works cited page. This font should always be in 12 point, never a smaller or larger font size. I can tell when you're not using Times New Roman. I can tell when you're using a size other than 12. Please just use the proper font type and size. It's just very obvious visually, okay? This is one that I definitely mark a lot of points down for, because this is a very easy rule to follow. So if you're not following it, you will lose a lot of points. So that is everything that I have for you in terms of formatting guidelines. I hope that this was useful, but I also hope that my discussions of kind of how to construct the concentrated close read was also helpful. I recognize that this is a bigger assignment, and one of the challenges of online learning is that we're not getting the usual chalkboard and rough drafting time that we would have in person. So I mean it when I say, please don't hesitate to meet with me in office hours, to call me, to email me, to reach out to me in general. If you are struggling, have questions, have a draft you'd like me to review, however I can be of support, let me know, because I know that, kind of as we transition to this bigger writing, it can be kind of intimidating. Okay, so that is everything I got for you today in English 1110. Congratulations on making it through 3 lectures, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.